She is known today as one of the most beautiful women in history. Her intelligence was just as legendary as her beauty, and yet most people have never heard of her name. Welcome to the channel. Today we will meet one of the most mysterious women in world history. We will look at how she went from a young princess with big dreams to becoming one of the richest women of her time and the most powerful queen of Egypt. The story begins in the city of Alexandria. In the year 69 BC, it was here that Cleopatra, who would later become famous throughout the world, was born. But what is less well known is that her name was not actually Cleopatra. Her birth name was Cleopatra Thea. Her last name, Cleopatra, means father is great in ancient Greek. She belonged to the so-called Ptolemaic dynasty. This dynasty had ruled Egypt since the year 305 BC, when Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great, took control of the country. Although they had been ruling over Egypt for almost 200 years, the Ptolemies were not of Egyptian origin, but were in fact Macedonian Greeks. Cleopatra was thus a Greek woman with a slight Egyptian admixture. Over the centuries, the royal family had intermarried with Persians, and then there was the affair with Julius Caesar, which resulted in Cleopatra having an heir with the genes of the entire Mediterranean region in him. But back to the beginning of the story. Cleopatra grew up in the royal palace in Alexandria. In addition to speaking Greek, she also learned to speak Egyptian, a language no other member of the royal house bothered with. Since childhood, it was clear that Cleopatra was an exceptional woman. While the other members of the royal family were more concerned with pleasures and luxury, Cleopatra dealt with serious matters. She was highly intelligent and eager to learn. In her youth, she was considered a wonder of the world. This assessment was not only due to her intelligence and knowledge, but above all to her beauty. As already mentioned, Cleopatra knew 2 languages, and according to legend, she knew how to captivate every listener with her voice. She played the harp and wrote poetry. In addition, she liked to appear in public dressed in magnificent robes and decked out with precious jewelry. Cleopatra was proud of her appearance and was well aware of the effect she had on men. We can get an idea of this from the writings of Roman historians, who were not exactly known for their objectivity when it came to women. According to them, Cleopatra was incredibly beautiful. However, modern historians assume that Cleopatra was probably not as beautiful as she is often described. Most likely, Cleopatra knew how to present herself very well and used this art to dominate the men of her time. The situation in the kingdom was anything but peaceful. For centuries, the Ptolemies had been ruling Egypt, but the royal family hated each other so much that there was practically a permanent civil war in the country. Brothers killed each other, sisters betrayed each other. When Cleopatra's father Ptolemy XII died, Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII were crowned king and queen. From that moment on, however, the two were no longer a loving brother and sister, but bitter rivals who wanted to rule all of Egypt for themselves. Cleopatra was clever and ambitious, but Ptolemy XIII was much more ruthless. He had his older sister Bernice put to death because she claimed the throne after their father. This deed shows us that right from the start, Cleopatra was in mortal danger. The only thing that protected her was her position as queen. At that time, it was unthinkable that a woman could rule the kingdom alone. So while Cleopatra was officially queen, the real power lay with her little brother. The precarious situation in Egypt was further complicated by external circumstances. The once great kingdom was increasingly coming under the influence of Rome. The Roman Republic was like a hungry wolf that was slowly but surely tearing the carcass of the once mighty Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra recognized this danger early on, and was determined to do everything in her power to protect her homeland. But to achieve this goal, she needed power. Officially, the power was in the hands of her brother, but in reality, he was far too young and inexperienced to deal with such serious matters. Thus, Cleopatra acted as regent and de facto ruled the kingdom in the name of her brother. Shortly after taking office, Cleopatra set about modernizing the country. Many administrative posts were filled by qualified civil servants, some of whom were even paid higher salaries. In addition, Cleopatra promoted trade and restored order in the state. To present herself as a true Egyptian ruler, Cleopatra had the traditional royal emblem, the sun crown, placed on her head. This move did not go down well with her brother, who felt that his authority had been undermined. The dispute between the two escalated over the years, until finally in 48 BC, Ptolemy XIII died under mysterious circumstances. Some suspect that Cleopatra had her brother poisoned, while others believe that he simply drowned in the Nile during a boat trip. In any case, Cleopatra now ruled Egypt as the only monarch. It was only the beginning of her reign, and Cleopatra had many plans that she wanted to put into practice. But to achieve her goals, she needed a lot of money. The royal treasury was empty, and so Cleopatra began minting new coins. In order to improve the financial situation of the kingdom as quickly as possible, Cleopatra continued her brother's policy of granting noble titles to influential Romans in exchange for large sums of money. However, she soon realized that if she wanted to assert herself against the Romans, she needed more than just money. She needed an army. When Cleopatra took the throne, Egypt was a poor shadow of its former self. The Roman Republic was so powerful that it could easily subjugate the kingdom, but Cleopatra didn't care about that. She knew that with her charm, she could convince anyone to join her cause. Her first target was Gaius Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. At that time, Julius Caesar was at war with Pompey, who was also aiming for sole control of the Roman Republic. Cleopatra knew which side her bread was buttered and sent him expensive gifts and a delegation of 50 elephants. Caesar was impressed by the magnificence of the gifts and decided to help her secure the throne. But Cleopatra had something else in mind. She slipped into Caesar's bed and gave birth to his son Caesarion. Now Caesar was bound to Cleopatra by blood ties, and had to return to Rome to deal with his enemies. There, he made sure that Caesarion and Cleopatra received part of Caesar's inheritance. With this money, Cleopatra was now rich enough to build her own army. The queen was finally powerful enough to feel safe on her throne. In the following years, Cleopatra expanded her influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean. She waged wars against the Syrian Seleucids and the Armenian kingdom of Artaxiad. Thanks to her strong army, Cleopatra was able to gain valuable land for her kingdom. Once again, the Egyptians were proud of their queen. It seemed as if nothing could shake Cleopatra from her throne. But then Mark Antony appeared. Cleopatra had previously kept a low profile, viz., the Romans, but that changed when Mark Antony came to power. Mark Antony was the triumvir of the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. He had huge ambitions, and dreamed of conquering the kingdoms of the Parthians. His plan was to use the Egyptian navy to do this, but for this purpose, he needed ships. Cleopatra had a navy of around 180 ships, which was one of the largest navies in the Mediterranean at the time. Antony asked Cleopatra to lend him some of these ships, but the queen refused. Antony was furious and marched on Alexandria with his troops. It was the beginning of the end for Cleopatra. During the siege of Alexandria, Antony fell in love with Cleopatra. Like Caesar before him, he fell for the queen's charms. Together, the two had 3 children. Cleopatra was deeply in love with Antony, but he was married to Octavian, the later Emperor Augustus, and could not be with her. When Octavian found out about the relationship, he declared war on Cleopatra and her brother Caesarion. Octavian besieged Alexandria for months. Finally, Cleopatra and Antony fled to a small island in the middle of the Nile. There they took their own lives rather than surrendering to Octavian. Cleopatra was one of the last members of the Ptolemaic dynasty. With her death, the ancient Egyptian kingdom ended. Shortly thereafter, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. Had Cleopatra lived in our time, she would certainly have made it into the Guinness Book of World Records as the richest woman of all time. The value of her estate is estimated to be around $7 billion US. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Ancient Egyptian history is full of bizarre stories and legendary people, but there's one person who truly stands out from the rest. She was beautiful and intelligent. She knew how to manipulate people to get what she wanted, and in the end, she died trying to seduce one of the most powerful men in the ancient world. Her name was Cleopatra, and this is the insane story of how Cleopatra seduced Julius Caesar, one of the most insane stories from ancient Egypt. Part 2. The Rise of Cleopatra. Cleopatra wasn't born into power. She was born in 69 BC, and was the daughter of King Ptolemy XII and his sister, Cleopatra V. When Cleopatra's father died, he left the throne to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. The problem was that Ptolemy XIII wasn't happy with sharing the throne. He wanted all the power for himself and kicked Cleopatra off the throne. But Cleopatra refused to accept her fate. She gathered supporters and started a civil war against her own brother. Now, while this was going on, word spread throughout the empire of this war in Egypt. And one man in particular was very interested in what was happening, Julius Caesar. At this point in his life, he was the most powerful Roman leader there ever was. He had conquered Gaul and made himself very rich and famous in the process. As he grew older, he started looking for ways to expand his power even further, and he thought that Egypt could be a great asset. That's because Egypt controlled the trade routes that brought valuable goods like spices, gold and ivory to the Mediterranean. If Caesar could control Egypt, then he would control the entire Mediterranean trade network. And that's why he sent his army to take over the country. Caesar's forces landed in the city of Alexandria and immediately started attacking Ptolemy's navy. Meanwhile, Cleopatra realized that she couldn't beat Caesar in a battle, so she had to do something else to gain his favor. She needed to impress him somehow, and she came up with an insane plan. It was so crazy that it might have only worked for someone like Cleopatra. It was rumored that when Cleopatra met Caesar, she presented herself to him in the most extravagant way possible. She had herself smuggled into his palace in a carpet. Yes, you heard that right, a carpet. She had some servants wrap her in a carpet and roll her up like a giant burrito. Then she was smuggled into the palace unnoticed. Some historians believe that this story is false, but we don't know for sure. What we do know is that this story has been passed down through the ages, and it tells us everything we need to know about Cleopatra. She was bold, she was intelligent, and she knew how to make an entrance. And that's exactly what she did. When Caesar opened the carpet, he found Cleopatra inside. We don't know what he thought when he saw her, but we can imagine that he was probably shocked at first. He had never seen anything like her before. Cleopatra was known for her beauty, but there was more to her than just her looks. She was also very intelligent and quick-witted. When Caesar asked her a question, she was always able to come up with a clever answer. She was fluent in 9 languages and knew how to use her intellect to her advantage. But there was another thing that set her apart from the other women in Caesar's life: her charm. Cleopatra knew how to make men feel special and important. She was a master manipulator and knew how to get what she wanted. Caesar was a notoriously womanizer, but he had never met anyone like Cleopatra. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen before, not just because of her looks or her intellect, but because of her charm. Cleopatra knew how to make him feel special and important, and she used this to her advantage. She won over Caesar and convinced him to help her reclaim her throne. With Caesar's help, Cleopatra was able to defeat her brother and take back her throne. The two of them ruled Egypt together for a time, and it was during this time that they formed a close bond. But their relationship wasn't just a romantic one, it was also political. Cleopatra knew that she could unrule Egypt without Caesar's support, and she did everything she could to keep him on her side. She gave him gifts, she flattered him, and she even let him stay in her lavish palaces. However, everyone wasn't happy about their relationship. The Egyptians were outraged that a foreign invader was living in their country, and they hated Cleopatra for cooperating with him. They saw her as a traitor and wouldn't speak to her. But Cleopatra didn't care what the Egyptians thought of her. All that mattered was that she had Caesar's support. She knew that he was the most powerful man in the ancient world, and she was ungoing to waste that. She used her relationship with Caesar to gain influence in Rome. She visited the city many times and stayed in Caesar's palace, where she met some of the most important people in Rome. She was a hit in Roman society, and everyone wanted to know her. Cleopatra was smart enough to realize that she couldn't just sit around and wait for Caesar to give her power. She had to go out and get it for herself. So she used every opportunity she had to make a name for herself in Rome. In Egypt, Cleopatra was the queen of the Nile. In Rome, she was just a guest, but she didn't let that stop her. She used her intelligence and charm to work her way into the hearts and minds of the Roman elite. She was a master at playing the game of politics, and she knew how to use her position to her advantage. As Cleopatra's influence grew in Rome, so did her power in Egypt. She was no longer just the queen of the Nile. She was a key player in the Roman political game. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she wasn't afraid to use her power. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar lasted for several years, but it eventually came to an end. Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, and Cleopatra was devastated. She had lost the most powerful man in the ancient world, and she knew that she would never find anyone like him again. However, she was a survivor, and she knew that she had to move on. She couldn't afford to sit around and mourn the loss of Caesar. She had a kingdom to run, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra had to deal with a new set of challenges. She had to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics and make sure that Egypt's interests were protected. She also had to deal with the fallout of Caesar's assassination. Rome was in chaos, and Cleopatra had to make sure that Egypt was not dragged into the conflict. Despite all the challenges she faced, Cleopatra was up to the task. She was a strong and capable ruler, and she was not afraid to make tough decisions. She knew that she had to put the needs of her kingdom first, and she was willing to do whatever it took to protect her people. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar may have ended, but her legacy lived on. She had proven herself to be a capable and intelligent ruler, and she had shown that she was not afraid to stand up for what she believed in. She was a true leader, and her people loved her for it. Even though Cleopatra's story is mostly remembered through the lens of her relationship with Julius Caesar, she was so much more than just the woman who seduced the most powerful man in the ancient world. She was a brilliant strategist, a fierce warrior, and a compassionate ruler. She was also a master manipulator and a cunning politician. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she should be remembered as such. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos. As you know, Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome, stabbed to death by a group of senators who feared he was becoming too powerful. And after Caesar's assassination, his former lover Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile, fled back to Egypt with his son Caesarion. Now, in today's episode, we're going to find out how Cleopatra used Caesar's son to take control of Rome and become the most powerful woman in the ancient world. You don't want to miss this. It's gonna be awesome. As we left off last time, Caesar had just been assassinated. His great rival Pompey the Great had just left Rome and taken control of the Roman Senate, and Rome was basically being held hostage by a group of senators known as the Liberators, or the Liberators. But the most important thing for Cleopatra at that moment was the safety of her young son, Caesarion, who was only around 2 years old at this point, because if the wrong people got their hands on him, they might kill him, believing that doing so would get rid of another Caesar claimant to the throne and put an end to any hopes of a Caesar dynasty. So she immediately took him back to Egypt for safekeeping, and it seemed like everything was going according to plan. Because word came back to Cleopatra that Octavian Caesar's grandnephew, and also a Caesar claimant, had actually been declared Augustus, which meant he was adopted into the Caesar family and given all of Caesar's titles, lands, and power. so it appeared that her son Caesarion would never have to worry about Augustus, because Caesarion was too young to really be a threat. However, little did Cleopatra know that Augustus wasn't exactly the peaceful leader everyone hoped he would be. After Augustus took power, he began to strip away many of the liberties the Romans had grown accustomed to under Caesar. He raised taxes, decreased salaries, and even ordered the execution of several senators who were close to Caesar. Soon, the entire Roman populace grew to hate his guts. And those haters were only growing by the day. Meanwhile, Cleopatra and Caesarion lived a very comfortable life in Alexandria, Egypt. For the past few years, Cleopatra had been romantically involved with a number of Roman leaders, including Julius Caesar and Roman general Pompey. The affair with Caesar produced a son Caesarion, while her relationship with Pompey resulted in 2 daughters, both of whom would later become queens of Egypt. And the reason she had so many lovers is because Cleopatra was a shrewd politician. She understood the benefits of having allies in Rome, and she used her feminine wiles to secure them. However, now that Caesar was dead and Rome was descending into chaos, Cleopatra realized she needed more than just lovers in Rome. She needed a powerful ally. And luckily for her, there was someone in Rome who wanted to help her. This guy's name was Mark Antony, and he was one of Rome's leading generals. In fact, when Caesar was assassinated, he was the only person outside of Rome who wasn't happy about it. At first, Antony refused to march his legions on Rome to take revenge on the assassins, instead choosing to wait for Augustus to get his affairs in order and then decide what to do next. But while Antony waited, word came back to Rome from the east that the Parthians were marching west, threatening to invade Roman Asia Minor, and so Antony didn't have a choice but to leave Rome and lead his army against the Persians. Before he left, though, he sent a letter to the Roman Senate declaring that he would avenge Caesar's death, and as soon as he finished fighting the Parthians, he would return to Rome and punish the assassins. But as Antony rode his horse across the countryside, his thoughts couldn't help but drift to Cleopatra. He had met her once before, and even though she was half black, half white, he found her absolutely breathtaking. And ever since meeting her, he had developed strong feelings for her. So much so, in fact, that he was willing to defy the entire Roman Senate just to see her again. So after defeating the Parthians, Antony turned his horse south toward Egypt. When Cleopatra heard that Antony was coming to see her, she prepared accordingly. She dressed in fine linen, put on her finest perfume, and had her hair braided and adorned with precious jewels. Then she climbed into her royal barge with her sisters and sailed down the Nile to meet Antony. But Cleopatra had no idea what was in store for her. When Antony saw Cleopatra for the first time, he was completely captivated. He felt as if the goddess Aphrodite had come down from Olympus, just to seduce him. And Mark Antony wasn't the type of man to resist such advances. In fact, he gave in to them wholeheartedly. As soon as the 2 lovers laid eyes on each other, they were smitten and quickly fell madly in love. But their romance wasn't the only thing that blossomed that day. Cleopatra and Antony also struck a political alliance. Antony promised to help restore order to Rome and end the civil war that had been raging for years, and Cleopatra promised to give Antony whatever he needed to achieve his goals. This included giving him 200 elephants, which he would use to put down rebellions across Rome. However, not everyone was pleased with Cleopatra's decision to align herself with Mark Antony. Her sister Arsinoe was furious and warned Cleopatra that Antony was nothing but trouble. She told Cleopatra that Antony was already married to a Roman woman named Octavia, and that he would never divorce her to marry Cleopatra. Furthermore, Arsinoe said that Antony wasn't strong enough to rule Rome on his own, and that if Cleopatra aligned herself with him, she would be dragged down into the mud with him. But Cleopatra ignored her sister's warnings and continued her romance with Antony anyway. In fact, she traveled to Rome with him, and the 2 lovers paraded through the streets together in a golden chariot. They put on quite the show for the crowds, driving around in a chariot pulled by 8 white horses, while Cleopatra wore a golden crown upon her head. They even hosted a banquet together in the Roman Senate where they planned to restore order to the empire. However, this was easier said than done because even though the people loved Cleopatra, they hated Mark Antony. You see, just days before the banquet, Antony had executed 4 Roman senators who opposed him, and the citizens weren't exactly thrilled about that, but Cleopatra didn't care. She was head over heels in love with Mark Antony, and she knew that together they could rule the Roman Empire as king and queen. Meanwhile, Augustus was furious about Cleopatra's presence in Rome and the way Mark Antony had treated the Roman senators, so he began spreading rumors that Antony was going to make Cleopatra Empress of Rome, which of course would mean Augustus would have to step down and give up his power. But the problem was that these rumors were true. Antony and Cleopatra did plan on ruling Rome together, and Antony actually proposed the idea of a 3-way marriage between him, Cleopatra, and even his brother Lucius. But Lucius rejected the proposal, and so did Octavia, Antony's wife. For that matter, in fact, Octavia was so disgusted by the thought of a 3-way marriage that she demanded a divorce from Antony, and she took their children with her as she left. Antony, however, was unfazed by his wife's rejection. He was still determined to marry Cleopatra, whether Octavia liked it or not. And this, of course, enraged Augustus even more. Augustus knew he couldn't defeat Antony in battle, so he tried to trick him. He wrote a letter to Antony saying that he was worried about the future of Rome, and asked his adopted brother to come to his villa to discuss it. Once Antony arrived, however, Augustus confronted him about Cleopatra and ordered him to choose between her and Rome. To his credit, Antony didn't hesitate. He chose Cleopatra, but his decision would soon come back to haunt him. After Antony sided with Cleopatra, Augustus threw his support behind a new military campaign against the Parthians, and when news of Antony's victory reached Rome, the people erupted in celebration. Soon, everyone was calling him the new Julius Caesar. Antony was so confident in his power that he even planned to invade Parthia with Cleopatra by his side. But before he could set out on his campaign, messengers arrived from Rome telling him that Augustus had invaded Egypt. Cleopatra and Antony were stunned. They had no idea this was coming, but Antony was determined to defend his lover, so he immediately set out for Egypt with his army. Cleopatra's enemies, meanwhile, were ecstatic. They had waited years for Julius Caesar's former lovers to turn on one another, and now it was finally happening. But Cleopatra and Antony would have the last laugh. They joined forces and defeated Augustus's army, after which Antony forced the future emperor to recognize Cleopatra and Caesarion as Caesar's rightful heirs. Now, Cleopatra and Caesarion had become the most powerful couple in the ancient world, and Antony was content to live the rest of his life in Alexandria with his one true love. But that's it for this episode, my friends. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Bye. What is the origin story of one of the most famous couples in history? You might be thinking about Kim and Kanye, but no. I'm talking about Cleopatra and Mark Antony, perhaps history's most famous power couple whose love story has endured through the centuries. However, their relationship wasn't all smooth sailing. In fact, it caused an undeclared civil war that resulted in the deaths of not just them, but thousands upon thousands of others. Welcome to my channel, and today let's find out what really happened to Cleopatra and Antony's kids. First off, did they even have any? When Queen Cleopatra of Egypt and Roman general Mark Antony got hitched, they weren't exactly doing the cha-cha slide. They were busting out some serious ancient Egyptian and Roman moves. It was a match made in ancient history heaven, or so it seemed. After all, who wouldn't want to team up with the most powerful woman in Egypt and one of Rome's top military men? Now, you might be wondering, why did these two get hitched in the first place? Well, it wasn't just because they were head over heels for each other. There was some serious strategy involved. Cleopatra wanted to secure her kingdom-s alliance with Rome, and who better to make it official than her main squeeze, Mark Antony. The wedding took place in a lavish ceremony in Alexandria in 323 BCE. It was the kind of party that would make even Kim and Kanye's nuptials look like a backyard barbecue. Imagine that. But here's where things get a little messy. Cleopatra and Antony weren't just getting cozy with each other. They were also getting cozy with the idea of ruling the known world. They had 3 children together, all boys. And that meant that their dynasty was set to rule Egypt and Rome like the ultimate power couple. But not everyone was happy about this new royal family. One person who wasn't exactly thrilled about Cleopatra and Antony's union was Rome's other leader, Octavian, later known as Augustus. He saw Cleopatra as a threat to his power, and he wasn't exactly fond of her living the high life in Egypt, while he was slaving away in Rome. You know, those pesky responsibilities of being a leader. Now, to be fair, Antony didn't exactly have the best track record when it came to keeping his eye on the ball. When it came to Roman politics, he was more interested in hanging out with Cleopatra and enjoying the finer things in life than dealing with the day-to-day affairs of Rome. That left Octavian feeling a little bit like he was shouldering the weight of the world on his own. As the saying goes, there can only be one Caesar, even if your name is actually Octavian. He began spreading rumors that Cleopatra was corrupting Antony against Rome and using her influence to try to take control of the empire. Talk about a toxic partner. It wasn't long before tensions between Antony and Octavian reached a boiling point. They were basically arch-enemies at this point, ready to go to war over who would be the ultimate leader of Rome. And we all know that when there's a power struggle going on, children are often caught in the crossfire. Speaking of children, what happened to Cleopatra and Antony's kids? Sadly, their sons never really stood a chance. Antony and Cleopatra's eldest son, Caesarion, born in 47 BC, was named after Antony's close friend and Caesar's grandnephew, Caesar Octavius, who would later become the first emperor of Rome under the title of Augustus. But don't let that fool you. Despite having the same name, Caesarion had no claim to the Roman throne. His half-brother, Caesar Octavius, on the other hand, was Augustus's legitimate heir. And once Antony and Cleopatra's relationship started going south, it was clear that Caesarion's chances of taking the throne were about as likely as Julius Caesar coming back from the dead and starting a TikTok account. The situation became even more complicated when Antony made the mistake of all mistakes. He gave Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe the Younger, the role of queen in a puppet state in the Levant. This move was seen as a direct threat to Octavian's power, and it was the last straw in their already rocky relationship. In 323 BCE, Octavian declared war on Antony and Cleopatra, kicking off a series of events that would change the course of history forever. It was a full-blown, undeclared civil war. As the two power couples faced off, it became clear that there could only be one winner, and sadly, it wasn't going to be Cleopatra and Antony. The relationship had become a liability for both of them, and it was tearing apart not only their personal lives, but the very fabric of the Roman Empire. Despite the odds being stacked against them, Cleopatra and Antony refused to back down. They assembled their armies and prepared to do battle with Octavian and his allies. But as the war dragged on, it became clear that they were in over their heads. Now, you might be asking, how did Cleopatra and Antony lose their kingdoms? Well, let's just say it was a total disaster. Antony had put all of his eggs in the Egyptian basket, so to speak. He'd given up his Roman citizenship and was ruling Egypt alongside Cleopatra. That meant that if they lost the war, they would lose everything. And let's face it, when you're fighting against someone as ruthless as Octavian, you don't want to be on the losing side. Octavian was a master manipulator, and he used every trick in the book to take down his enemies. He spread false rumors, made secret alliances, and played dirty games to keep his rivals off balance. And it worked like a charm. Meanwhile, Cleopatra was struggling to keep her cool. She knew that she and Antony were in a tough spot, but she refused to give up without a fight. Even though Cleopatra was a badass queen who could hold her own in a battle of wits, she couldn't save herself and Antony from what was about to come next. Octavian's forces were closing in on them, and they were running out of options. In 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra made a last-ditch effort to save their relationship and their kingdoms. They fled to the port city of Actium in Greece and prepared for a final showdown with Octavian's forces. The battle was epic, involving over 800 ships and tens of thousands of soldiers. But in the end, it was a total defeat for Cleopatra and Antony. Now you might be asking, what went wrong? Well, let's just say that communication wasn't their strong suit. As the battle raged on, Cleopatra and Antony's fleet began to weaken. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and it was clear that they couldn't win. Cleopatra wanted to call it quits and flee to India, but Antony refused. He was determined to fight to the death. You know what they say? Go big or go home. And Cleopatra and Antony went big in their final moments. When it became clear that their ships were doomed, they ordered them to be set ablaze. As the flames engulfed their vessels, they gathered their loved ones, including their children, and prepared to take their own lives. Now, you might be wondering, what happened to their kids during all this chaos? Well, sadly, we don't know for sure. History tells us that Caesarion was executed by order of Augustus, but the exact details are a bit murky. Some historians believe that Caesarion was killed along with Cleopatra and Antony, while others believe that he survived and lived out the rest of his life in hiding. We may never know what really happened to him. Cleopatra chose to take her own life by allowing an asp, an Egyptian snake, to bite her. Antony wasn't far behind her. He died by his own hand, refusing to surrender to Octavian. So who really won this epic love story gone wrong? Well, it's hard to say. Antony and Cleopatra lost their lives and their kingdoms, but Octavian paid a heavy price. He had to fight a brutal war and outlive his closest friends and allies. In the end, he emerged victorious, but at what cost? The Battle of Actium marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. But it also left a power vacuum in the east. Octavian had defeated Antony and Cleopatra, but he hadn't fully secured their territories. The region would remain unstable for years to come, and Octavian would have to fight many more battles to keep his power secure. The legacy of Cleopatra and Antony lives on in art, literature, and film. They're often portrayed as star-crossed lovers whose passion for each other was doomed from the start. But their story is more than just a tragic romance. It's a tale of two powerful leaders who dared to defy the odds, and in doing so changed the course of history forever. So what's the moral of this crazy tale? Don't mess with the divine right of kings, especially when there's gold, glory, and power involved. Just saying. Actium was a disaster for the forces of Antony and Cleopatra, but after they lost that battle against Octavian, where did they go, and how did they die? You're about to find out. After suffering a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Actium, Mark Antony fled the scene with his lover, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, to escape their enemies. They sailed down the western coast of Greece, then south through the Mediterranean to Egypt. The couple made it back to Alexandria in late September of 32 BC. Their ships had managed to evade the pursuing fleet of Octavian, who would become the first emperor of Rome. But Antony and Cleopatra knew that their armies had been shattered and were no longer safe in Alexandria. Octavian didn't waste any time. He sailed his fleet into the eastern Mediterranean and began advancing on Alexandria. Even though he had not intended to chase them there, this gave Octavian a great opportunity to seize Egyptian territory. As he moved closer to Alexandria, he took cities throughout the Levant. By the end of 32 BC, he had taken all of the cities that Antony and Cleopatra held outside of Egypt proper. So when word reached Rome that the Egyptian queen had arrived, the Senate declared her an enemy of the Roman state and sent out troops to destroy her. In Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra fortified the city and prepared to resist the coming siege. They assembled what remained of their navies and stationed them along the coast. However, these vessels were damaged from the recent battle and couldn't withstand a full-scale assault. So instead, they hid them in the royal harbor. Knowing that the sea was their only hope, Antony divided his land forces among 3 commanders and ordered them to defend the west, northwest, and north of the city. Octavian established his main camp on the eastern side of the Nile River from Alexandria, opposite the city walls. From here, he began sending his soldiers across the river to fortify positions around the city. But the Egyptians quickly attacked these workers, realizing that if they were allowed to finish their fortifications, they'd never get out alive. Octavian ordered his engineers to build pontoon bridges so his men could advance into the city unopposed. But Antony's troops destroyed these bridges as soon as they were finished. This back and forth went on for weeks until finally, Octavian ordered his engineers to construct floating pontoon bridges. These worked perfectly, and his soldiers were soon able to advance inside the city. His cavalry quickly took up positions around the harbors and prevented Antony and Cleopatra from escaping by sea. This was bad news for the defenders. Without the use of their navy, the city would fall. Now, Octavian gave them an option to surrender. If they laid down their arms, he promised the city's inhabitants that he would allow them to keep their property and spare their lives. However, Antony and Cleopatra chose defiance over surrender. Cleopatra refused to bend the knee to her enemies, and she continued to fight. However, as Octavian's forces grew stronger, her chances of winning the battle diminished. Her allies were slowly being picked off one by one, and it seemed like the end was near. Sure enough, her last 2 generals were defeated in battle. One committed suicide and the other was killed in battle. As the Romans advanced deeper into the city, Cleopatra found herself trapped in a small area around her palace. She may have realized at this point that winning the battle was impossible, but that still didn't mean she'd surrender. She attempted to rally her remaining forces and mount a last stand. However, these attacks failed, and soon afterwards, her forces collapsed. All throughout the city, citizens who had not already fled were forced to pay tribute to the victorious Romans or leave the city. Some of Cleopatra's treasure was used to buy grain to feed the starving populace of Rome. Antony and Cleopatra were now trapped in the royal palace, and it seemed like the end was near. But what happened next is not exactly known. History tells us that Mark Antony fell on his own sword and died, but some accounts say that he was actually murdered. How did he die? Well, according to Plutarch, Antony woke up one morning and realized that his enemy had won. He called for his armor to be brought to him, and when it was, he strapped it on and prepared to lead one last charge out of the city. However, when his guards came to escort him to his horse, he fell on his own sword. Other sources claim that his armor was too tight and that he accidentally stabbed himself while trying to put it on. There are even claims that he was murdered by one of his guards. Who knows? What we do know is that Cleopatra never surrendered. Historians believe that she let a poisonous asp, also known as a snake, bite her. She could have gotten the snake from her cloak of armor, because back in those days, people kept venomous snakes as a way of defending themselves. Either way, she received a venomous bite somewhere on her body and died peacefully. Later that day, Octavian entered the palace and found both Antony and Cleopatra dead. No one really knows what happened behind those palace walls, but that doesn't stop people from trying to figure it out today. When Octavian entered the palace, he expected to find resistance, but there was no one there. At least that's what most historians believe. Some say that before dying, Cleopatra gathered up her loyal servants and guards and left the city through a secret tunnel underneath the palace. This passage would have led them to the safety of the east side of the Nile River, where they could live out the rest of their lives. This theory says that this is why none of Cleopatra's servants or guards were found within the palace walls. But if this were true, why didn't Cleopatra take this route herself? Why did she stay behind? After all, this was the woman who escaped from Julius Caesar's assassins by hiding under a woman's skirt. You can bet she could have easily escaped through the tunnel. We may never know for sure. What we do know is that when Octavian entered the palace, he found both Cleopatra and Mark Antony dead. There were no signs of a struggle, and nobody else was hurt. It appeared as though Cleopatra and Antony had taken their own lives rather than face capture by Rome. It seemed that the great Queen Cleopatra had met her match in Octavian. Cleopatra's death is shrouded in myth and legend. Historians agree that she probably died by allowing a venomous snake to bite her, but different accounts tell vastly different stories of her final moments. Some say that she willingly embraced death, while others claim that she was terrified as the snake slowly poisoned her. What's more, there are rumors that she used the snake as a means of escape, drinking a vial of poison just before it bit her. This would explain why no one found traces of venom in her body, since she was already dead when the snake bit her. Whether or not these legends are true remains unknown. Regardless of how she died, Cleopatra's story has captured the imaginations of people all over the world. Her story has inspired countless works of art, literature, and film, and will continue to do so for centuries to come. So what happened next? When Octavian entered the palace, he found both Antony and Cleopatra dead. He allowed the people of Alexandria to keep their wealth and property if they surrendered, but those who chose to fight back were put to death. This wasn't a difficult decision for most of them. Many of the Alexandrians had already fled to other parts of Egypt, and only a handful of warriors remained. After subduing the city, Octavian had to deal with Cleopatra's brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was still holding out in the eastern part of Egypt. He fought against Octavian's general, Agrippa, and was defeated. Agrippa pursued him, and Ptolemy fled to the city of Actium. He hoped to escape from here, but his ship was caught in a storm, and he was thrown overboard. When Octavian learned of this, he ordered that Ptolemy be brought before him. He treated him fairly well and allowed him to keep his fortune if he agreed to marry Octavian's sister Octavia. However, Ptolemy was never loyal to Rome and broke free of his prison. He was eventually executed by order of Octavian. With this, Egypt came completely under Roman control, and Octavian was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. He returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph over his defeated enemies. His statue was erected in the Roman Forum, and temples were built in his honor throughout the empire. Soon afterwards, he took the title of Augustus and became the first emperor of Rome. It's safe to say that Cleopatra never would have guessed that when she played games with the likes of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, that it would lead to her becoming the first victim of the Roman Empire. Though the ancient Egyptian kingdom was never revived, its pharaohs and rulers continued to capture the imagination of the people for hundreds of years. Cleopatra is remembered as a symbol of feminine wiles, beauty, intelligence, and tragic fate. The story of Cleopatra is truly a tale of love, power, politics, and tragedy that changed history forever. Now you need to watch what really happened to Cleopatra's body, or check out how did famous last Egyptian pharaoh die.